The rain hammered against the windows as Margaret poured hot water into her teacup. Thunder rumbled in the distance as she wrapped her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. 3 sharp knocks shattered the quiet. Margaret froze. Nobody visited this late, especially not in weather like this. Her heart began to race. She set down her cup and moved slowly toward the entrance. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. Another knock, more desperate this time. Margaret opened the door and gasped. Catherine stood there, soaked to the bone, clutching little Olivia in her arms. The child slept despite the chaos. 5 years. 5 years of silence, and now this. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she took in her daughter's hollow eyes and trembling frame. Catherine's lips moved, but barely any sound came out. She swayed slightly, her strength clearly failing her. The rain continued its relentless assault behind her. Margaret's mind flashed back to that terrible day. Catherine, 7 months pregnant, had screamed that her mother was never there for her. The pregnant woman declared that Margaret would never be there for her daughter either. The memory of Catherine's final words echoed through Margaret's soul. Margaret snapped back to reality. Whatever had happened before didn't matter now. She pulled Catherine and Olivia inside immediately, shutting out the storm. She gently laid Olivia on the sofa and covered her with a thick blanket. The little girl didn't stir, exhausted from whatever ordeal they had endured. In the kitchen, Catherine collapsed into a chair. Silent tears mixed with rainwater as Margaret draped a towel around her daughter's shaking shoulders. Margaret knelt beside her daughter and took her cold hands. She asked what had happened, her voice cracking with emotion she had suppressed for 5 years. Catherine looked up, her face a portrait of complete devastation. Her voice came out as barely a whisper, broken and defeated by months of struggle. Her husband had left her. The words fell like stones. Catherine's shoulders shook as the dam finally broke. She had lost her job as well. They had evicted her and Olivia from their apartment. She had nowhere else to go. Catherine's voice dissolved into sobs that she had clearly been holding back for months. Margaret pulled Catherine into her arms, holding her daughter for the first time in 5 years. Tears streamed down her face as she stroked Catherine's wet hair lovingly. Through the doorway, Olivia slept on, innocent and unaware. The granddaughter Margaret had never been allowed to meet, lay just feet away from her. Margaret gazed at the little girl and felt her heart swell and break simultaneously. 5 years of birthdays missed, first words unheard, precious memories stolen by pride. Catherine pulled back slightly, meeting her mother's eyes for the first time in years. Shame and desperate hope warred across her exhausted features. Margaret cupped Catherine's face gently, thumbs wiping away tears. She whispered that they were home now. Both of them were home. Despite everything, love had remained strong. As the storm raged outside, mother and daughter sat together in the warm kitchen. 5 years of silence hung between them, but for the first time, reconciliation felt possible. Where are you watching from today? If this story is touching your heart, please leave a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of faith, family, and forgiveness. 5 years earlier, the hospital waiting room had been filled with tension. Catherine, her belly swollen with new life, had stood with her arms crossed defensively. She had called Margaret there under the pretense of discussing baby preparations, but her true intention had been far different. The younger woman's eyes had blazed with years of accumulated resentment, finally ready to explode. Margaret had arrived hopeful, carrying a bag of hand-knitted baby blankets she had spent weeks making. She had no idea what was about to unfold. Margaret had smiled as she approached her daughter, excitement bubbling in her chest at the thought of becoming a grandmother. She had practiced what she would say, how she would offer to help with the baby, how she would make up for lost time. But Catherine's expression had stopped her cold. There was no warmth in her daughter's eyes, only ice and fury. Margaret's smile had faltered as she realized this was not the joyful reunion she had imagined. Something was very wrong. Catherine had started listing every absence, every missed moment, every broken promise. The school recitals where Margaret's chair sat empty. The birthday parties where she had arrived late or not at all. The science fair where Catherine had won first place but celebrated alone because her mother had been working a double shift. Each memory was a knife, carefully sharpened by years of hurt. Margaret had tried to explain, to defend herself, but Catherine had not been interested in explanations. She had only wanted her mother to hear the pain she had carried for so long. Then Catherine had brought up the worst night of all, the night her father died. She had been only 15 years old, sitting alone in that same hospital, watching her father take his last breath while her mother was somewhere else in the building, working. Margaret had not been there to hold her hand. She had not been there to say goodbye together. Catherine had faced that devastating moment completely alone, and she had never forgiven her mother for it. The memory had haunted her for 17 years. Margaret had tried desperately to explain. The double shift had been necessary to pay for Richard's treatments. The nights away from home had been spent working to keep their house, to pay for Catherine's college fund, to ensure they did not lose everything to medical debt. She had been trying to protect her daughter from the crushing financial burden that came with her father's illness. But Catherine had not wanted to hear about sacrifices or good intentions. She had only known the absence, the loneliness, the feeling of being second place to her mother's career. Catherine had placed her hand on her pregnant belly protectively and delivered the words that would haunt Margaret for 5 years. She declared that Margaret was never there for her, so she would never be there for her daughter either. This baby would never know the pain of waiting for a grandmother who never showed up. This child would be protected from the disappointment that had defined Catherine's childhood. Margaret would have no part in this baby's life. The decision was final and non-negotiable. Margaret had stood frozen as Catherine walked away, her hands still extended in a gesture of connection that would never be completed. Tears had streamed down her face as she watched her daughter disappear around the corner, taking with her any hope of knowing her grandchild. The bag of baby blankets had slipped from Margaret's fingers and fallen to the floor. Other people in the waiting room had stared, but she had not noticed them. Her world had just shattered into a million pieces, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the years that followed, Margaret had tried everything to bridge the gap. She had written letter after letter, pouring her heart onto paper, explaining, apologizing, begging for a chance. Each one had been returned unopened, the word refused stamped across the envelope in cold, impersonal letters. She had sent birthday gifts for Olivia, carefully chosen toys and books for a granddaughter she had never met. Those two had come back, rejected without a second thought. Every attempt at connection had been met with a wall of silence that seemed to grow thicker with each passing month. Margaret had resorted to watching from afar. She had learned Catherine's schedule, knew which supermarket she frequented, which park she took Olivia to on sunny afternoons. From her car parked at a careful distance, Margaret had watched her granddaughter grow from an infant to a toddler. She had seen Olivia's first steps through tears, celebrated silently when the little girl had laughed at the ducks in the pond. But she had never been able to approach, never been able to introduce herself. Once, Catherine had looked directly at her mother's car, and Margaret had seen the flash of recognition followed by deliberate turning away. The church had become Margaret's refuge during those dark years. Pastor Chun had listened to her pain every Sunday, offering wisdom and comfort when a loneliness threatened to consume her completely. He had prayed with her for reconciliation, for softening of hearts, for God's intervention in what seemed like an impossible situation. Margaret had clung to her faith like a lifeline, believing that somehow, someday, things would change. She had prayed for her daughter's happiness, for Olivia's health and safety, and for the strength to accept whatever God's plan might be, even if it meant never being part of their lives. The morning light filtered softly through the kitchen window as Catherine sat wrapped in one of her mother's thick blankets. Her hands trembled as she held the mug of hot tea Margaret had prepared. She had barely slept, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Margaret sat across from her, waiting patiently for her daughter to find the strength to explain what had brought her to this desperate moment. The silence between them was heavy, but no longer hostile. It was the silence of two people trying to find their way back to each other after years of pain and separation. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving only the gentle sound of water dripping from the eaves. Catherine took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. She explained that everything had started falling apart about 8 months ago. Her husband Marcus had become distant and cold, working late constantly, barely acknowledging her or Olivia when he came home. She had tried to talk to him, to fix whatever was breaking between them, but he had shut her out completely. Then one evening, she had found text messages on his phone that confirmed what she had feared deep down. He had been having an affair with a co-worker for over 6 months. The discovery had shattered her world completely. Catherine's voice broke as she described the moment of finding those messages, the feeling of her heart literally breaking inside her chest. The confrontation had been brutal and devastating. Marcus had not even tried to deny it or apologize. Instead, he had blamed Catherine for everything, claiming she had become boring and consumed by motherhood. He had accused her of letting herself go, of caring more about Olivia than about him. He had packed his things that very night and moved in with the other woman. Within 2 weeks, divorce papers had arrived. He had fought for nothing except his freedom, gladly signing away most parental rights. He wanted to start fresh with his new life, and that life did not include his daughter. Catherine sobbed as she described watching Olivia ask for her daddy day after day, not understanding why he had disappeared. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand tightly, her own tears falling silently. As if the divorce was not devastating enough, Catherine continued. Her professional life had collapsed simultaneously. The marketing firm where she had worked for 7 years had been bought out by a larger corporation. Mass layoffs had followed within weeks. Catherine, still reeling from her personal crisis, had been let go along with half her department. She had tried to find another position immediately, sending out hundreds of resumes, going to countless interviews. But the job market was brutal, and every rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of her life. Her savings had dwindled rapidly as she tried to maintain some stability for Olivia while paying for the divorce lawyer and covering basic expenses. The weight of it all had been crushing. Then had come the eviction notice. Catherine's voice trembled with shame as she admitted she had fallen 3 months behind on rent. The landlord had been patient at first, but eventually had no choice but to begin eviction proceedings. She had begged for more time, promised she would find a job soon, but the law was the law. 30 days to vacate. She had tried calling old friends. People she had known before marriage and motherhood had consumed her life, but she had let those relationships wither. Most did not even return her calls. The few who did offered sympathy, but could not help with housing. Pride had prevented her from explaining just how desperate her situation truly was. She had always been the successful one, the one with everything together, and admitting complete failure felt impossible. Margaret stood and pulled Catherine into her arms, holding her daughter as she had when Catherine was a little girl with scraped knees and hurt feelings. But this pain was so much deeper, so much more complex. She whispered that Catherine was safe now, that she and Olivia could stay as long as they needed. Catherine cried harder, the relief and shame mixing into a torrent of emotion. She admitted that coming here had been her absolute last resort, that her pride had almost prevented her from knocking on that door, even in the pouring rain. But when she had looked at Olivia sleeping in the back seat of her car, wet and cold because they had nowhere to go, she had realized she had to swallow her pride for her daughter's sake. A soft sound made both women turn. Olivia stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes sleepily. She wore a pair of pajamas that Margaret had bought years ago and kept in the unused bedroom, hoping against hope that someday her granddaughter might need them. The little girl looked confused and frightened, not recognizing her surroundings. She called out for her mother in a small, scared voice. Catherine quickly wiped her tears and went to scoop up her daughter, holding her close and reassuring her that everything was all right. But Olivia's eyes kept darting to Margaret, this stranger in whose house they had apparently spent the night. Margaret knelt down to Olivia's eye level, her heart pounding with nervousness and joy. She introduced herself with a gentle smile, explaining that she was Olivia's grandmother. The little girl looked up at Catherine for confirmation. Catherine nodded, her voice thick with emotion as she told Olivia that this was Mommy's mommy and that they were going to stay here for a while. Olivia studied Margaret with serious blue eyes, taking in every detail of this grandmother she had never known existed. After a long moment, she asked in a small voice if Margaret had any toys. The simple, innocent question broke through the tension, and both women laughed through their tears. Margaret assured her that she did indeed have toys, waiting in a special room just for her. Margaret led Olivia to the bedroom she had prepared years ago. The little girl's eyes went wide with wonder at the sight of the toys, books, and stuffed animals that filled the shelves. Everything was organized and dust-free, lovingly maintained despite never being used. There were dolls and building blocks, puzzles and art supplies, all carefully chosen for different ages as Margaret had imagined her granddaughter growing up. Catherine stood in the doorway watching, overwhelmed by the realization that her mother had never stopped hoping, never stopped preparing for the possibility that they might come back. The room was a shrine to love and faith, a testament to a grandmother's unbreakable bond with a child she had never met. As Olivia began exploring her new room with cautious excitement, Margaret and Catherine stood in the hallway together. Catherine whispered her gratitude, her voice breaking with emotion. She apologized for everything, for the 5 years of silence, for the cruel words spoken in anger, for depriving her mother of knowing Olivia. Margaret gently placed a hand on Catherine's cheek and told her that what mattered now was moving forward together. They had been given a second chance, painful as the circumstances were, and she was determined not to waste it. The past could not be changed, but the future was unwritten. For the first time in years, both women felt a glimmer of hope that healing might actually be possible. The first week in Margaret's house was a delicate dance of adjustment and uncertainty. Mornings began with Margaret preparing breakfast, while Catherine helped set the table and Olivia watched everything with cautious curiosity. The little girl was polite but distant, not quite sure what to make of this new living arrangement or this grandmother who appeared out of nowhere. She asked frequently when they would go back home, not understanding that there was no home to return to. Catherine's heart broke a little more each time she had to explain that they were staying with Grandma for a while. Margaret handled each awkward moment with patience and grace, never pushing, always allowing Olivia to come to her in her own time and on her own terms. Olivia struggled with the massive changes in her young life. She would sit surrounded by toys, but not play with them, her mind clearly elsewhere. She cried at night for her father, not understanding why he had disappeared from her life so completely. She missed her old room, her old routine, the familiar comfort of the only home she had ever known. Margaret watched her granddaughter's sadness with an aching heart, wishing she could absorb the pain and spare the child from such heavy emotions. Catherine was doing her best to comfort Olivia, but she was drowning in her own grief and shame, barely keeping her head above water emotionally. The apartment felt heavy with unspoken sorrows and unresolved pain. Catherine spent her days searching desperately for employment. She applied to dozens of positions each day, tailored cover letters until her eyes burned, reached out to every professional contact she could remember. Margaret brought her endless cups of coffee and words of encouragement, offering to watch Olivia so Catherine could focus entirely on her job hunt. But the rejections came one after another. Form emails thanking her for her interest, but informing her they had moved forward with other candidates. Each rejection chipped away at Catherine's confidence a little more. She had always been successful, competent, capable. This prolonged failure made her question everything she thought she knew about herself and her worth. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Margaret had decided to bake cookies and invited Olivia to help. The little girl had been hesitant at first, but the promise of chocolate chips had been too tempting to resist. As they measured and mixed together, Margaret told stories about when Catherine was little and how she had loved helping in the kitchen too. Olivia listened with growing interest, asking questions about what her mother was like as a child. Margaret shared funny memories, gentle ones, stories that painted Catherine as human and relatable. when Olivia accidentally spilled flour all over both of them. She had frozen in fear, waiting to be scolded. But Margaret had simply laughed and made a flour angel on the counter, and for the first time since arriving, Olivia had genuinely smiled. Catherine had come into the kitchen to find her mother and daughter covered in flour, laughing together as they shaped cookie dough into imperfect circles. She had frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the sight. This was the grandmother Olivia should have known from birth. This was the warmth and love Catherine had denied her daughter because of her own hurt and pride. Watching them together, seeing the gentle way Margaret guided Olivia's small hands, hearing her daughter's laughter for the first time in weeks, Catherine felt the full weight of what she had stolen from both of them. Tears streamed down her face, but for once they were not entirely tears of grief. There was relief mixed in, and hope, and the beginning of healing. That evening, Olivia asked Margaret to read her a bedtime story. It was a simple request, but it meant everything. Margaret had selected a book from the shelf in Olivia's room, one she had bought years ago, imagining this very moment. As she read, Olivia had gradually snuggled closer until her head was resting on Margaret's shoulder. The little girl's breathing had slowed, her body relaxing in a way it had not since arriving. Margaret's voice had remained steady as she read, but her heart was soaring. Catherine watched from the armchair, witnessing the bond beginning to form between grandmother and granddaughter. She pulled out her phone and took a picture, wanting to remember this moment forever, this evidence that broken things could indeed begin to mend. After Olivia was asleep, Catherine and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with tea between them. The comfortable silence of earlier had shifted into something heavier. Catherine made a passive-aggressive comment about how Margaret finally had time to be the grandmother she never was as a mother. The words hung in the air like poison. Margaret had absorbed them without responding immediately, understanding they came from a place of deep pain. But the comment had stung nonetheless. She had sacrificed everything for Catherine, worked herself to exhaustion, given up her own dreams and comfort. And still, it was not enough. Still, she was judged and found wanting. The unfairness of it burned in her chest, but she swallowed the defensive words that wanted to pour out. Margaret had taken a deep breath and responded with quiet dignity. She acknowledged that she had not been present as much as Catherine had needed, but reminded her daughter gently that she had been working to keep them afloat financially during impossible circumstances. She explained once again that every absence had been a sacrifice, every missed event a wound to her own heart. She had done the best she could with what she had, making impossible choices with no good options. Margaret's voice had remained calm but firm, refusing to be diminished by Catherine's pain-driven attacks. She loved her daughter, but she would not accept complete blame for circumstances that had been largely beyond her control. The truth deserved to be acknowledged, even if it was uncomfortable. The next day, Pastor Chun had visited at Margaret's request. She needed spiritual guidance and support as she navigated these difficult waters. They sat on the front porch as the sun set, and Margaret poured out her heart about the joy of having her family back mixed with the pain of Catherine's continued resentment. Pastor Chun had listened with the patience of someone who had heard countless confessions and struggles over his decades of ministry. He reminded Margaret that healing was not linear, that Catherine was processing years of hurt and would likely lash out as part of that process. He encouraged Margaret to continue showing love while also maintaining healthy boundaries. Forgiveness, he reminded her, was a journey, not a destination. That evening, Margaret had suggested watching old family videos together. Catherine had been hesitant, but Olivia's enthusiasm had won out. They sat together on the couch as grainy footage played of Catherine as a toddler, then a young girl, then a teenager. There was footage of birthdays and Christmases, of Richard pushing Catherine on a swing, of Margaret teaching her to ride a bike. Catherine had watched herself as a child, seeing things she had forgotten or chosen not to remember. There was love in those images, clear and undeniable. Her mother had been there for many moments, even if not all of them. The house that had felt heavy with tension for days began to feel lighter. Laughter mixed with tears as they watched together, 3 generations connected by blood and slowly, carefully, beginning to connect through understanding and grace. 3 weeks into their stay, Olivia had been exploring the house with growing confidence when she discovered the attic access in the hallway ceiling. The pull-down stairs had been folded up, but she had noticed the small handle and asked Margaret what was up there. Margaret had hesitated, knowing the attic contained boxes of memories she had packed away years ago, unable to look at them without pain. But Olivia's curious eyes had been so hopeful, and Margaret found herself unable to deny her granddaughter anything. She pulled down the creaky wooden stairs and warned Olivia to be careful as they climbed up together into the dusty space above. Afternoon light filtered through a small window, illuminating floating dust particles and casting everything in a golden, nostalgic glow. The attic was filled with boxes labeled in Margaret's careful handwriting. Olivia had immediately gravitated toward one marked Catherine, Childhood, and begun pulling it open before Margaret could stop her. Inside were treasures from Catherine's youth, report cards with gold stars and teacher comments praising her intelligence, artwork carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, school photos showing gap-toothed smiles and changing hairstyles through the years. There were handmade Mother's Day cards with crayon flowers and declarations of love in wobbly child handwriting, participation ribbons from track meets, programs from school plays, even the dried corsage from Catherine's senior prom. Margaret had kept everything, unable to part with any piece of her daughter's journey from childhood to adulthood. Downstairs, Catherine had heard the creaking footsteps above and Olivia's excited voice echoing through the ceiling. Concern had driven her to climb the attic stairs, wondering what her daughter had gotten into. As her head emerged through the opening, she saw Olivia surrounded by boxes, holding up a drawing of a house with stick figures labeled Mommy and Me. Margaret knelt beside the little girl, explaining that Catherine had drawn that picture in first grade. Catherine's breath had caught in her throat as she fully entered the attic and saw box after box of her childhood carefully preserved and stored. She had assumed her mother had thrown everything away years ago, maybe when she remarried or moved houses. She had never imagined that Margaret had kept it all. Catherine knelt beside a box and began pulling items out with trembling hands. Her third-grade science fair project about volcanoes, the ribbons still attached. Her 8th-grade yearbook with messages from friends she had long forgotten. A baby book meticulously filled out with her first word, first step, first tooth lost, all documented in Margaret's handwriting. Awards from debate club, certificates from honor roll, even the terrible poetry she had written as an angsty teenager. Her mother had treasured it all, preserved every accomplishment and memory as if they were priceless artifacts. Olivia chattered excitedly about seeing her mother as a little girl, asking questions about each item. But Catherine could barely speak, overwhelmed by the realization that she had been so deeply cherished all along. Then Olivia had discovered a shoebox tucked behind the larger boxes. She pulled it out and opened it before Margaret could react, revealing a thick stack of envelopes. Catherine took the box from her daughter's hands and examined the contents with growing confusion. They were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to her at various addresses she had lived at over the past 5 years. But these were not the letters that had been returned. These were letters that had never been sent. Each envelope was sealed and stamped, ready to mail, but had remained here in the attic instead. Margaret's face had gone pale, and she reached for the box, but Catherine pulled it back, needing to understand what she was holding. With shaking hands, Catherine opened the first envelope. It was dated just 2 months after their confrontation at the hospital. Margaret's handwriting filled the page with words of love, apology, and desperate longing. She wrote about the nursery she had prepared for Olivia, about prayers she said every night for both Catherine and the baby, about how sorry she was for every moment she had missed during Catherine's childhood. She wrote about understanding Catherine's anger, but hoping that someday forgiveness might be possible. The letter ended with a plea to please let her be part of Olivia's life, to not let the mistakes of the past rob the future of its possibilities. Catherine's vision blurred with tears as she reached for another letter, then another, each one a window into her mother's broken heart. Margaret explained in a quiet, ashamed voice why the letters had never been sent. She had written them as a way to process her grief and maintain hope, pouring her heart onto paper in the dark, lonely nights. But each time she prepared to mail one, fear had stopped her. Fear that Catherine would read it and feel harassed. Fear that it would make things worse instead of better. Fear that the rejection of these heartfelt words would hurt more than the silence. So she had sealed them and kept them, a record of love that was never delivered. She had told herself that maybe someday, if reconciliation ever happened, she could give them to Catherine. Or maybe they would simply remain here forever, unsent messages to a daughter who would never know how desperately she was loved and missed. Deeper in the attic, Catherine found an old trunk containing journals. She recognized them immediately as her mother's diaries from years ago. Margaret tried to stop her from opening them, saying they were private, but Catherine was beyond caring about boundaries. She needed to understand the truth. She opened a journal from a year her father died and began reading. The entries were devastating in their raw honesty. Margaret had written about the impossible weight of being the sole provider while Richard was dying, about working double shifts at the hospital while her own husband was a patient in the same building, about crying in supply closets between shifts because she could not let Catherine see her fall apart, about the crushing guilt of choosing work over being present, but knowing that without the money, they would lose everything. Catherine found the entry from the night her father died. She read with trembling hands as Margaret described Richard insisting that she go to work that night. He had known he was dying and had wanted Margaret to keep her job for Catherine's sake. He had made her promise not to sacrifice her employment for his final hours, knowing that Catherine would need her mother's income to finish school and build a life. Margaret had written about sitting in the nurse's station, knowing her husband was dying floors below, feeling like her heart was being torn in two. She described rushing to his room the moment her shift ended, but arriving 3 minutes too late. She wrote about finding 15-year-old Catherine sitting alone beside Richard's body, and the look of betrayal in her daughter's eyes that would haunt her forever. The guilt and grief poured from the pages in words that were never meant to be read by anyone. Catherine closed the journal and looked at her mother through new eyes. All these years, she had believed a narrative of neglect and abandonment. But the truth was so much more complex and painful. Her mother had not chosen work over family. She had chosen survival, made impossible sacrifices, carried unbearable burdens alone to protect her daughter from the full weight of their circumstances. Catherine began to sob, and this time Margaret joined her, both women crying for the lost years and the misunderstandings that had stolen so much from them both. They held each other in that dusty attic surrounded by boxes of preserved memories, finally beginning to see each other clearly for the first time in decades. Olivia slept peacefully against a box nearby, unaware that the walls between her mother and grandmother were finally beginning to crumble. That evening, after Olivia had been put to bed, Catherine sat in the living room surrounded by the journals and letters they had brought down from the attic. Margaret sat in the armchair across from her, hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting for the confrontation she knew was coming. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken words and years of misunderstanding. Catherine looked up from the journal she had been reading, her eyes red from crying, her expression a mixture of devastation and confusion. She needed answers. She needed to understand how she had gotten everything so wrong for so long. Margaret braced herself, knowing that the truth she had kept hidden to protect Catherine was about to come out in ways that might be painful for them both. Catherine asked about the medical bills mentioned repeatedly in the journals. She had never known about any significant medical debt. Her father's insurance had covered the hospital stays, or so she had believed. Margaret took a deep breath and began to explain the truth she had hidden for nearly 2 decades. Richard's insurance had covered only a portion of his treatment. The experimental medications he had tried, the specialist consultations from doctors out of network, the multiple hospital readmissions, all of that had fallen outside their coverage. The bills had been staggering, arriving month after month like a crushing avalanche of debt. Margaret had hidden them all from Catherine, who had been just a teenager trying to navigate high school and cope with watching her father deteriorate. Margaret explained that she had worked those double and triple shifts not just to keep food on the table, but to pay down the medical debt that threatened to bankrupt them and destroy Catherine's future. She described coming home at dawn after 16-hour shifts, sleeping for 3 hours, then returning to the hospital for another shift. The other nurses had thought she was obsessed with work or running from grief, but the truth was she had been running toward survival. Every extra hour meant another payment on the bills, another month closer to being debt-free, another step toward ensuring Catherine could go to college without the burden of her father's illness following her. Margaret's voice cracked as she admitted that she had nearly worked herself into an early grave trying to protect her daughter from the financial devastation. Catherine asked about the nights Margaret had supposedly been at the hospital working when Richard was dying. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she revealed another painful truth. Many of those nights, she had not been working her regular shift at all. She had been staying at the hospital specifically to care for Richard during his worst episodes, the times when the pain was unbearable and he could not rest. She would sit with him through the night, managing his medications, adjusting his position, holding his hand through the agony. She had done this without telling Catherine because Richard had insisted on protecting his daughter from seeing him at his absolute worst. They had agreed together that Catherine should remember her father as strong and vital, not as a man destroyed by disease. So Margaret had carried that burden alone in the dark hours. Then Margaret revealed the truth about the night Richard died. Catherine had always believed her mother had chosen to work instead of being present for her husband's final moments. But the reality was far more heartbreaking. Richard had been lucid that evening and had called Margaret to his bedside privately. He had known his time was very short, and he had made Margaret promise to go to her scheduled shift. He had been adamant that she could not afford to lose her job, not when Catherine still had 2 years of high school left and college applications coming. He had told Margaret that he would wait for her to return if he could, but if he could not, she must not blame herself. He had extracted a solemn promise that she would think of Catherine's future before his present comfort. Margaret described how she had argued with Richard, begged to stay, but he had been insistent with the stubbornness that had defined their marriage. He had told her he loved her, kissed her hand, and sent her to work with a promise that everything would be all right. She had worked her shift in a daze, checking the phone constantly, her heart in her throat with every overhead page. Her supervisor had found her crying in the supply closet during her break, but she had refused to leave. She had honored her husband's dying wish even though it was tearing her apart. When the call had finally come that Richard's condition was deteriorating rapidly, she had run through the hospital corridors, still wearing her scrubs. But she had arrived 3 minutes too late. 3 minutes that had haunted her every day since. Catherine broke down completely as she finally understood the truth. Her mother had not been absent by choice or indifference. Every decision, every sacrifice, every moment away had been an act of love and protection. Margaret had carried the weight of keeping their family afloat financially while also trying to shield Catherine from the full horror of her father's decline. She had made impossible choices with no good options, always putting Catherine's future ahead of her own needs and comfort. The anger that Catherine had nursed for 17 years suddenly had nowhere to go. It dissipated like smoke, leaving only grief for the wasted years and gratitude for a mother who had loved her more than she had ever understood. Margaret showed Catherine one more truth. She brought out an empty jewelry box, the velvet interior still shaped by the pieces that had once rested there. She explained that she had sold every piece of jewelry Richard had ever given her, including her engagement ring and the family heirlooms passed down from her mother and grandmother. The money had paid for Richard's funeral, ensuring he had a dignified service and burial rather than the county cremation they could have been forced to accept. She had wanted Catherine to be able to visit a proper grave, to have a place to say goodbye. The rings and necklaces meant nothing compared to her daughter's ability to grieve properly. Catherine stared at the empty box, overwhelmed by yet another sacrifice she had never known about. Catherine stood and crossed the room, pulling her mother into her arms. She apologized over and over through her tears, begging forgiveness for the cruel words, the years of silence, the judgment and condemnation. She admitted that she had been so consumed by her own pain that she had been blind to her mother's suffering. She had constructed a narrative of neglect that fit her anger but bore little resemblance to reality. Margaret held her daughter tightly, also apologizing for not communicating better, for trying to protect Catherine by keeping secrets that had ultimately driven them apart. They cried together, truly together, for the first time since Richard's death. The walls that had stood between them for so long finally crumbled completely. From the hallway, Olivia had awakened and wandered out to find the adults. She stood in her pajamas, watching her mother and grandmother hold each other and cry. She did not fully understand what was happening, but she sensed something important shifting in the atmosphere of the house. The tension that had hung in the air since they arrived felt lighter somehow. She saw her mother smile through tears for the first time in months. She saw her grandmother's face transformed by relief and joy. The little girl did not comprehend the complexities of adult pain and reconciliation, but she understood on some instinctive level that her family was healing. She padded quietly back to bed, feeling safer and more settled than she had since her whole world had turned upside down. The days following their emotional breakthrough felt like living in a different house entirely. The atmosphere had shifted from tension and careful politeness to genuine warmth and connection. Margaret and Catherine moved around the kitchen together preparing breakfast, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of growing comfort. They laughed at small things, shared inside jokes, touched each other's shoulders in passing with casual affection. Olivia set the table without being asked, humming to herself, delighting in the peace that had settled over her small world. The change was so profound that it felt almost miraculous, as if years of ice had melted overnight to reveal the loving relationship that had always existed beneath the frozen surface. Catherine and Margaret began to truly talk, not just exchange necessary information, but share their lives with honesty and vulnerability. Catherine opened up about her marriage, describing how she had ignored warning signs from the beginning because she had been desperate not to be alone. She admitted that Marcus had been controlling and dismissive long before the affair, but she had convinced herself it was normal. She shared her fears about being a single mother, her insecurities about whether she was doing right by Olivia. Margaret listened without judgment, offering wisdom from her own experiences and reassurance that Catherine was stronger than she knew. She shared her own struggles with loneliness after Richard's death, how the silence of the empty house had nearly broken her. One sunny afternoon, they visited Richard's grave together for the first time in years. Catherine had not been back since the funeral, unable to face the pain and guilt. But now, with her mother beside her, and Olivia's small hand in hers, she felt ready. They stood before the simple headstone as Margaret told stories about Richard, painting a picture of a man who had been funny and stubborn and deeply loving. Olivia listened with wide eyes, learning about the grandfather she would never meet. Catherine spoke to her father's grave, telling him she finally understood the sacrifice he and Margaret had made, thanking him for protecting her even in his final moments. She felt a sense of closure settling over her heart, a release of the anger she had carried for so long. Margaret had invited Catherine to attend church with her, and to her surprise, Catherine had agreed. They sat together in the pew with Olivia between them, 3 generations united in faith and family. Pastor Chen's sermon that Sunday spoke about forgiveness and restoration, about how God could heal even the deepest wounds if hearts were willing to open. He noticed Margaret's radiant smile and the young woman and child beside her, and his own eyes had filled with grateful tears. After the service, he approached them and offered a special prayer of thanksgiving for their reunited family. Catherine felt the embrace of a community she had not known existed, people who had been praying for this reconciliation alongside her mother for 5 long years. Catherine had taken Margaret's gentle suggestion and started seeing a therapist to process the trauma of her divorce and the complicated emotions surrounding her childhood. In the safe space of the therapy office, she unpacked years of pain and misconception. She talked about the little girl who had felt abandoned, the teenager who had lost her father, the woman who had pushed away everyone who loved her out of fear and pride. Her therapist helped her see patterns in her behavior, ways she had sabotaged relationships because she had never learned to trust that love could be unconditional. She worked on strategies for healthy communication, for asking for help, for accepting that being vulnerable was not the same as being weak. The process was painful, but necessary. One afternoon, Catherine had been at the local coffee shop when a familiar voice had called her name. She turned to see Jennifer Park, her best friend from college and the early years of her marriage. They had lost touch when Catherine had withdrawn into herself after Marcus became controlling. Jennifer's face had lit up with joy at seeing Catherine, and within minutes they were sitting together sharing coffee and catching up. Catherine apologized for disappearing, for not returning calls and messages. Jennifer brushed away the apologies with understanding and grace, explaining that she had always wanted to be there, but respected Catherine's need for space. She admitted she had been praying for Catherine, hoping she was okay. The reconnection felt like a gift, a reminder that true friendship could survive even years of silence. Jennifer had become a regular visitor to Margaret's house, her presence adding another layer of support and love to their healing family. She and Margaret bonded quickly, both women grateful for the other's role in Catherine's life. Jennifer brought her warmth and humor, making Olivia laugh with silly voices and games. She treated Margaret with the respect and affection of an honorary mother figure. The house that had been so quiet for so long now regularly filled with conversation and laughter. Catherine watched her mother and her best friend interact, seeing her support system expand in ways she had never allowed before. She was learning that family was not just about blood, but about the people who showed up and stayed. Catherine's persistence in job hunting finally paid off when she received a call back from a digital marketing agency that had seemed like a long shot. The video interview went better than she dared hope. The hiring manager was impressed by her experience and creative portfolio. They discussed her gap in employment, and Catherine was honest about her divorce and housing crisis, framing it as a difficult period that had taught her resilience and humility. The interviewer appreciated her candor. 2 days later, the job offer came through. The salary was good, the position challenging and interesting, the company culture seemed supportive. Catherine had accepted immediately, crying tears of relief and gratitude as Margaret hugged her and celebrated this crucial step toward rebuilding her life. With employment secured, Catherine and Margaret had an important conversation about the future. Catherine expressed her gratitude for everything Margaret had done, but also her need to eventually establish some independence again. They discussed healthy boundaries, shared responsibilities, and how to maintain their newly healed relationship while also giving each other space. Margaret suggested that Catherine stay until she had saved enough for a deposit on an apartment, maybe 6 months or so. Catherine agreed, promising to contribute financially to household expenses now that she would have income. They talked about Catherine's commitment to therapy, to being a better mother to Olivia, to maintaining open communication so that misunderstandings would not fester into resentments again. The conversation was mature and honest, two adults treating each other with respect and care. That evening, they watched more old family videos, but this time the experience was completely different. Instead of painful revelations, they found joy in shared memories. They laughed at Richard's terrible jokes captured on camera, at young Catherine's dramatic theatrical performances at birthday parties and holiday celebrations. Olivia asked questions about everything, delighting in seeing her mother as a child. Catherine pointed out moments she had forgotten, seeing them now through the lens of understanding rather than resentment. Margaret shared stories behind the footage, the context that made each moment meaningful. They made plans to create new memories together, to film Olivia growing up so that someday she could look back and see herself surrounded by love. The house felt full in a way it never had before, not with things, but with hope and second chances and the strong foundation of a family finally whole. Catherine's first day at the digital marketing agency marked a turning point in her reconstruction. She walked into the modern office building with her head held high, dressed professionally, carrying the laptop bag Margaret had given her as a congratulations gift. The nervousness in her stomach was mixed with genuine excitement for the first time in months. This was not just a job. It was proof that she could rebuild, that failure was not permanent, that second chances were real. Her new colleagues welcomed her warmly, and by the end of the first week, she knew she had made the right choice. The work challenged her creatively and intellectually, reminding her that she was capable and talented, not just a woman defined by her divorce and losses. A new rhythm established itself in Margaret's household. Catherine would arrive home from work to find dinner being prepared, Olivia doing homework at the kitchen table under Margaret's watchful eye. But Catherine made sure to take over the evening routine, helping Olivia with her bath and bedtime stories, reclaiming her role as primary parent while still accepting Margaret's support. She contributed to groceries and utilities from her first paycheck, insisting on being a partner in the household rather than a dependent. Margaret accepted the contributions gracefully, understanding that Catherine needed to feel like she was pulling her own weight. The balance they struck felt healthy and sustainable, two adults sharing space and responsibilities with mutual respect. Olivia had blossomed in the stable environment. She had started at a new school and made friends quickly, her natural sweetness and curiosity making her popular with classmates and teachers alike. The sadness that had clouded her eyes for months had lifted, replaced by the light and joy that should define childhood. She rarely asked about her father anymore, having accepted in the way children do that some things simply were. She called Margaret Grandma with easy affection, crawling in her lap for stories and hugs without hesitation. The bond between them had grown deep and strong, built on patience and consistency and unconditional love. Catherine watched her daughter flourish and felt profound gratitude that she had swallowed her pride and come to her mother's door that rainy night. One evening, Catherine initiated a conversation that had been building for weeks. She thanked Margaret formally and completely for everything, not just for the recent months, but for the sacrifices of her entire childhood that she had been too blind to see. She acknowledged that her mother had given everything to ensure Catherine had opportunities and stability, even when it meant her own exhaustion and loneliness. She apologized again for the 5 years of separation, for the pain she had caused, for keeping Olivia away from such a loving grandmother. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes, then shared her own apologies for the times she truly had fallen short, for not communicating better, for thinking she had to carry every burden alone. They both acknowledged that the past could not be changed, but they could honor it by doing better moving forward. They had begun family therapy together at Catherine's therapist's suggestion. Sitting side by side in the comfortable office, they worked through difficult conversations with professional guidance. They discussed expectations and boundaries, how to communicate when frustrations arose, how to support each other without enabling unhealthy patterns. Margaret learned to express her needs instead of martyring herself silently. Catherine learned to ask for help before reaching crisis point. They practiced having hard conversations in the safe space of therapy so they could navigate them better at home. The therapist commended them both for their commitment to doing the work, noting that many families never got the chance at this kind of intentional healing. They began establishing new family traditions intentionally. Friday nights became movie night with homemade popcorn and Olivia choosing a film. Sundays meant church followed by brunch at a local diner. The three of them crowded into a booth sharing pancakes and stories from the week. They planned a simple vacation for the summer, just a weekend at a lake cabin, but the anticipation filled them all with joy. Margaret taught Olivia to bake the same cookies she had taught Catherine decades ago, creating a thread of tradition across generations. Catherine started a journal for Olivia, writing entries about their days together so her daughter would have a record of this time when everything changed for the better. The tension that had once filled the house had been completely replaced by peace and easy affection. Catherine and Margaret moved around each other in the kitchen with practice coordination, one making breakfast while the other packed Olivia's lunch. They shared small smiles over their coffee cups, communicated with glances and gentle touches, operated as a team. Olivia absorbed this harmony, learning what healthy relationships looked like, seeing that love could be expressed through small daily acts of care. The child who had arrived frightened and displaced now skipped through the house singing, secure in the knowledge that she was safe and cherished. The transformation in all three of them was remarkable to anyone who had known them before. Catherine had begun looking at apartment listings in the area, not out of urgency, but out of healthy planning. She had saved enough for a modest deposit and first month's rent. She showed Margaret a few options, discussing proximity and school districts. Margaret encouraged her to find something she truly liked, assuring her there was no rush. They talked about Catherine and Olivia moving out not as a separation, but as a natural progression. Catherine would live close by, just minutes away. They would still have their Friday movie nights and Sunday brunches. Olivia would spend weekends with Margaret regularly. The difference was that Catherine would have her own space, her independence re-established in a healthy way rather than lost in crisis. In the quiet of her bedroom at night, Margaret wrote in her journal with a full heart. She reflected on how God had answered her prayers in ways she could never have imagined. She had prayed for reconciliation, but had received so much more than that. She had her daughter back, truly back, with honesty and openness between them. She had a relationship with her granddaughter that was deep and real. She had a home filled with life and love instead of echoing silence. The years of loneliness and grief had not been erased, but they had been redeemed. She wrote prayers of thanksgiving, acknowledging that the pain had purpose, that the breaking had been necessary for the healing to happen. 6 months after that desperate knock on the door during the storm, the three of them sat around the breakfast table in complete harmony. Olivia chattered about her upcoming school play, excited that both her mother and grandmother would be in the audience. Catherine shared a funny story from work, her eyes bright with confidence that had been absent for so long. Margaret listened to them both with contentment radiating from her smile, occasionally reaching over to straighten Olivia's collar or squeeze Catherine's hand. The simple domestic scene represented everything they had fought for, everything they had almost lost, and everything they had finally found. They were not just living together out of necessity anymore. They were a family, healed and whole, choosing each other every single day. 6 months had passed since that rainy night when Catherine had arrived desperate and broken at her mother's door. Now she sat across from Jennifer in their favorite coffee shop, looking like a completely different person. Her eyes were bright and clear. Her shoulders no longer carried the weight of the world. Her smile came easily and often. She was thriving at work, her creativity and dedication earning her respect and increasing responsibilities. Her relationship with Margaret had deepened into something beautiful and sustaining. Olivia was happy and secure. Life had not just stabilized, it had blossomed. Jennifer remarked on the transformation, marveling at how far Catherine had come in such a relatively short time. Catherine credited her mother, therapy, faith, and friends like Jennifer who had believed in her even when she could not believe in herself. The divorce from Marcus had been finalized the previous month. The proceedings had been relatively straightforward since Marcus wanted nothing from the marriage except his freedom. He had signed away most parental rights, agreeing to minimal supervised visitation that he rarely exercised. The lawyer had expressed concern about such a complete abandonment of his child, but Catherine had accepted it as Marcus showing his true character. Olivia deserved better than a father who saw her as an obligation rather than a blessing. The legal closure brought relief. One more chapter definitively ended, so new ones could be written. Catherine left the lawyer's office feeling lighter, legally untethered from a man who had never truly valued her or their daughter. Then, unexpectedly, Catherine received a text message from Marcus. It had been 3 months since his last attempt at contact. The message was brief and awkward, asking if he could see Olivia. He claimed he had been thinking about his daughter and wanted to try being part of her life again. Catherine's first reaction was fury. He had abandoned them when they needed him most, disappeared completely, and now wanted back in on his terms. Her hands shook as she gripped the phone, anger flooding through her. She wanted to delete the message, block his number, protect Olivia from further disappointment. But then she paused, remembering her own journey of reconciliation with her mother, the grace she had been shown, the forgiveness that had transformed her life. Catherine showed the message to Margaret that evening, asking for guidance. Part of her wanted her mother to validate her anger, to support cutting Marcus out completely. But Margaret gently offered a different perspective. She reminded Catherine that forgiveness was not about Marcus deserving it, but about Catherine freeing herself from the poison of resentment. She pointed out that Olivia might someday want a relationship with her father, and Catherine closing that door permanently could create its own complications. Margaret was careful to clarify that forgiveness did not mean trust, that Catherine could allow supervised visits while maintaining firm boundaries. She shared her own experience of forgiving Richard's parents who had been cruel to her, explaining that the forgiveness had been for her own peace, not their benefit. After much prayer and consideration, Catherine agreed to a supervised visit at a public playground. She and Margaret brought Olivia to meet Marcus, staying close enough to intervene if needed. Olivia had been confused and hesitant, barely remembering the father who had been absent for so long. Marcus looked uncomfortable and out of place, his attempts at conversation stilted and forced. He had brought a toy as a peace offering, something generic that showed he did not really know his daughter at all. Catherine watched with a mixture of sadness and pity. This man had walked away from something precious because he was too selfish and immature to appreciate it. She felt no desire to reconcile romantically, but watching him fumble through small talk with Olivia, she felt her anger beginning to dissolve into something closer to indifference. After an hour, Marcus approached Catherine while Margaret kept Olivia occupied at the swings. He apologized, his voice thick with what seemed like genuine remorse. He admitted that he had been a coward, running when things got hard instead of supporting his family. He said the affair had been a selfish escape from responsibilities he felt unprepared for. He acknowledged that Catherine and Olivia deserved better than he had given them. He asked if there was any way he could try to be a father to Olivia, not to get back together, but to at least not be a complete failure as a parent. Catherine listened without interrupting, then responded with calm clarity. She told him that she had forgiven him, not because he had earned it, but because she refused to carry hatred in her heart. However, forgiveness did not erase consequences. If he wanted to be in Olivia's life, he would have to prove consistency and commitment over time. That evening, Catherine told Margaret she felt surprisingly at peace with the encounter. She realized that forgiveness had set her free from the emotional prison of resentment and anger. Whether Marcus followed through with being a better father or disappeared again, it no longer had the power to destroy her. She had built a life that did not depend on him, surrounded Olivia with love and stability, created a foundation that his presence or absence could not shake. Margaret embraced her daughter, proud of the growth and maturity Catherine had shown. She noted that Catherine had become the kind of woman who could extend grace even when it was difficult, who chose healing over bitterness. Catherine smiled and said she had learned it from watching her mother forgive her despite years of cruel rejection. They spent an evening recording video messages for Olivia to watch when she was older. Catherine and Margaret sat side by side, speaking to the camera about their journey of separation and reconciliation. They talked about the importance of forgiveness, of not letting pride prevent healing, of choosing love over being right. They shared lessons learned through pain, wisdom earned through mistakes, hope discovered in the darkest moments. Catherine spoke about her father, keeping his memory alive for a granddaughter who would never meet him. Margaret talked about faith sustaining her through years of loneliness. Together, they created a legacy of honesty and grace, a roadmap for Olivia to navigate her own future relationships and conflicts with wisdom her mother and grandmother had paid dearly to acquire. Catherine had found an apartment just 10 minutes from Margaret's house. It was small but bright, with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that got beautiful morning light. She and Margaret walked through the empty space together, planning where furniture would go, discussing paint colors and curtains. Olivia ran from room to room, claiming the smaller bedroom as hers. already imagining how she would decorate it. The move was scheduled for the following month. There was no sadness in the planning, only excitement and healthy anticipation. This was not Catherine running away or being pushed out. This was her stepping forward into independence while staying connected to the support system that had saved her life. Margaret would still watch Olivia after school most days. They would still have their Friday and Sunday traditions. But Catherine would have her own space, her own home, proof of how far she had come. On one of their last evenings, all living under the same roof, the three of them sat together in the living room, surrounded by photo albums and memory boxes. They looked at pictures from the past months, evidence of healing and new beginnings. Olivia pointed to photos of herself with her grandmother, amazed at how many memories they had already created together. Catherine showed Olivia the old pictures from her own childhood, the story of her family becoming clear and complete. Margaret held both her daughter and granddaughter close, overwhelmed with gratitude for the redemption of broken things. They made promises to each other about staying close, communicating honestly, never letting silence build walls between them again. The forgiveness that had started as painful and difficult had become the foundation of something beautiful and enduring, a family not destroyed by pain but refined and strengthened by it. 2 years had passed since that desperate rainy night when Catherine had knocked on her mother's door with nowhere else to turn. Now the three of them stood in Catherine's bright kitchen, covered in flour and laughing as they made cookies together. It was a Saturday afternoon tradition they had maintained religiously. Olivia, now 7 years old and confident, stood on a step stool measuring ingredients with careful concentration. Catherine and Margaret worked side by side with the easy coordination of people who had spent countless hours in each other's company. The apartment that Catherine had moved into 18 months ago had become a true home, but had never felt separate from Margaret's house. They were two parts of one family, connected by love stronger than any address could define. As they sat around the table enjoying their fresh-baked cookies, Olivia told them about a situation at school. Her friend Madison was not talking to her mother because they had argued about something Olivia could not quite understand. The little girl seemed troubled by the conflict, asking if it was normal for mothers and daughters to fight. Catherine and Margaret exchanged meaningful glances. Then Catherine gently explained that yes, sometimes families disagreed, but the important thing was not letting anger build walls that kept love out. She shared, in age-appropriate terms, that she and Grandma had once been separated because of hurt feelings, but they had found their way back to each other through forgiveness. Olivia listened with wide eyes, then announced that she would tell Madison to make up with her mom because families should stay together. Later that afternoon, they visited Richard's grave as they did every few months. It had become a ritual that connected Olivia to the grandfather she would never meet in life. The little girl placed flowers on the headstone and told him about her achievements in school, her growing collection of chapter books, her dreams of becoming a teacher. Catherine stood with her arm around her mother's waist, both women comfortable in this space that had once held only pain. Margaret told stories about Richard, keeping his memory alive and vibrant for her granddaughter. She spoke of his terrible puns, his love of baseball, the way he had danced with baby Catherine in the kitchen. The visits were no longer sorrowful obligations, but meaningful connections to their family history, proof that love transcended even death. Sunday morning found them in their usual pew at church, 3 generations sitting close together. Pastor Chun, now grayer but still vibrant, was preaching about restored families and the redemptive power of forgiveness. He had watched Margaret pray for reconciliation for 5 years, had counseled her through the darkest times, and now got to witness the answered prayers sitting before him every week. His eyes found theirs as he spoke about how God could heal even the deepest wounds when hearts were willing to soften. After the service, members of the congregation who had prayed alongside Margaret for years approached to hug them, their joy at the restored family genuine and touching. The church had become extended family, a community that had held Margaret up when she had no strength left. Their Sunday brunch tradition had expanded to include Jennifer, who had become as much a part of their family as any blood relative. The 4 of them crowded into a booth at their favorite diner, ordering too much food and laughing over shared stories from the week. Jennifer and Margaret had developed their own friendship independent of Catherine, often meeting for coffee or walks. Olivia adored her honorary aunt, who brought her small gifts and told funny stories. Catherine watched the women she loved interact and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 2 years ago, she had been alone and desperate. Now she had a support system that felt unbreakable, built not on obligation, but on genuine love and chosen commitment to each other. Marcus had continued his supervised visits with Olivia, though they remained infrequent and sometimes awkward. He had proven more consistent than Catherine had expected, showing up on his scheduled days and making genuine effort to know his daughter. He would never be Father of the Year, but he was trying, and Catherine had made peace with that being enough. She no longer felt anger when she saw him, only a detached acceptance. He was Olivia's biological father, and allowing that connection did not diminish the family Catherine had built. Margaret sat beside her on the park bench, both women reading books while keeping a watchful eye on Olivia playing. The situation was not perfect, but it was functional and healthy, proof that forgiveness could create space for complicated relationships to exist without causing destruction. One evening, Catherine and Margaret sat in the living room, looking through the journals and letters that had changed everything 2 years ago. They read passages aloud, marveling at how much pain those pages held and how far they had come from that place. Catherine admitted that finding those writings had been devastating but necessary, forcing her to confront truth she had been avoiding for decades. Margaret confessed that she had almost thrown the journals away 100 times, terrified of anyone ever reading her most private thoughts. They agreed that God had orchestrated even that discovery, using Margaret's hidden words to break through barriers that spoken explanations never could have penetrated. They decided to keep the journals and letters for Olivia to read someday, when she was old enough to understand the full complexity of their story. After tucking Olivia into bed, Catherine and Margaret stood in the doorway, watching the child sleep. They spoke in whispers about how different things could have been if pride and pain had won. Olivia might have grown up without knowing her grandmother, without the stability and love that had allowed her to flourish. Catherine might still be drowning in bitterness and struggle, too stubborn to ask for help even when desperate. Margaret might still be living in that silent house, praying for a reconciliation that seemed impossible. But instead, they had all been given a second chance, an opportunity to rewrite the narrative and choose love over hurt. They had taken that chance and transformed it into something beautiful and lasting. The following Sunday, Pastor Chun preached specifically about their family's journey, with their permission. He did not name them, but many in the congregation knew who he meant when he spoke of a grandmother who had prayed faithfully for 5 years and a daughter who had found her way home through humility and grace. He talked about how forgiveness was not weakness, but the greatest strength, how pride was the enemy of peace, how God specialized in restoring what seemed irreparably broken. Margaret held Catherine's hand on one side and Olivia's on the other, 3 generations linked physically and spiritually. Tears streamed down her face, but they were tears of joy and gratitude. Her story, once defined by loss and separation, had become a testimony of hope and redemption. On a beautiful sunny afternoon, the 3 of them walked through the park together, hand in hand. Olivia skipped between her mother and grandmother, chattering about everything and nothing, secure in the knowledge that she was loved and safe. Catherine looked at her mother and saw not the woman who had failed her, but the hero who had sacrificed everything for her family. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw not the angry girl who had cut her out, but the strong woman who had learned to forgive and rebuild. They had both been broken in different ways, but the breaking had created space for healing more profound than either could have imagined. Their story was one of pain transformed into purpose, of silence broken by honest communication, of walls demolished by radical forgiveness. As they walked together in the golden light, they carried forward a legacy not of perfection, but of grace, teaching Olivia, through their example, that love always finds a way, that it is never too late for reconciliation, and that forgiveness is the key that unlocks every door that pain has closed. Where are you watching from? What did you think of Margaret and Catherine's journey? If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below. Give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of faith, family, and the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds.